Okay, students, this is the final section or part of William Ball's Backwards and Forwards, and it begins with the attempt on his part to discuss more or less miscellaneous items of information. And so what I hope to do with you just now is to take you through some of those items and say a few words about them. And of course, I'm using a PowerPoint to help illustrate what I have to say. This part is called Tricks of the Trade, which is a rather interesting title. And essentially, that's why I think this is more or less a miscellaneous approach to the subject. The first thing he talks about is dealing with background information concerning the play. He puts a lot of attention on the notion that you should pay attention to the author and his background, as well as his other artistic works, the era in which the play was written, and also the artistic environment surrounding that era that might help to explain the approach that the person makes. Here we see Heinrich Ibsen sitting rather stoically, and it's, of course, Ibsen who wrote Hedda Gabler, which we've talked about at some length. And essentially some of his other plays, of the other plays of Sophocles, the other plays of Sophocles that one might approach and look at are Antigone, because of course it does deal with Oedipus myth. It's a point at which Oedipus is not in this play, but his two daughters are, and we saw the two daughters at the end of Oedipus Tyrannos. Also, we look in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, we could also look at Two Gentlemen of Verona, since the play is set in Verona, and we could look at that play from the point of view of how do the two plays, Romeo and Juliet and Two Gentlemen of Verona, fit or not fit each other, and also it may help to explain why Cibber made a rather drastic choice of setting the play Caius Marius in Rome, and then later on the play was adapted into one part Romeo and Juliet, one part Two Gentlemen of Verona, and that perhaps looking at the plays of Shakespeare besides Romeo and Juliet would be useful to you, obviously. Same thing with Ibsen's The Doll's House, because The Doll's House is a play about a woman who's confined by her husband in their home. It takes a very different approach to the way this woman deals with her background and experience. She's more or less comfortable and at home in this environment until she realizes that her husband really doesn't have any real deep love for her. And ultimately, she leaves the husband and leaves her children behind, not telling him whether she's coming back or if she's coming back. And, of course, a play that we're going to see very shortly, The Rez Sisters, in that piece, it would be useful to look at other plays by Thompson Highway to get a notion of how he approaches this subject of the Rez Sisters. And looking at many works by Wallace Shawn would be very interesting for you to do. For example, you might also look at My Dinner with Andre, which was a film he did more or less as a conversation between himself and Andre Gregory. And the kind of conversational approach that's taken in that film might be useful for you to understand how that is incorporated and used in Aunt Dan and Lemon and changed for a particular reason. We also must, according to Ball, we must trust the playwright. Basically, what he's saying is that everything in the play should be carefully examined before thinking of cutting or trimming it. And you have to decide for yourself, why is this piece of information or this scene or why are these characters in a particular part of the play? And when should cuts be made, and what are the justifications for making changes in the play's text? For example, some of you might well argue that it's possible to make changes and adjust a play that is in translation because basically there are various versions of the translation that may be chosen, and one could decide that one was better than the other. And making cuts in a particular version isn't quite as harrowing or difficult as it is, say, to make cuts in a play that is in English that the general public already knows. So, for example, what were the kinds of cuts that were made in Romeo and Juliet, and how did that influence or affect the play itself? This is a bust of the playwright Sophocles. This is just to further emphasize the fact that we must trust the playwright. And we see Ibsen, as you saw before, and this is our friend Wallace Shawn. And so essentially the notion is know the playwright, know what they may have in mind, and try to understand that before you try to adjust your own ideas and impose them on the play. Another factor that Ball has pointed out to us is the importance of families and the importance that family plays within a given work of art. In particular, I think you could say that many American plays in particular deal with the issue of family and family relationships. You need to find out what those relationships are, and also you need to understand, does the play itself redefine the scope of what family is? These are a few scenes here that I want to point out to you from of an Elizabethan family. Here you see on this side of the table, the girls are located, and on this side, the boys are located, boys in the family. And we have the father here, and we have the mother here. And who the rest of these characters are, I can't really say, but I do think that you need to be aware that in that period in time, the separation between men and women was imposed in that family setting. Also, we find an American family, what seems to be an American family, and there are different kinds of families. There seems to be, in this picture, above husband, wife, child. And the same thing probably holds true. This is probably the husband and the wife, and perhaps this is the father of one of these figures. And on the left side of the picture, there are two older people, which may well be, instead of the husband and wife, they may be the grandparents of the kids that you see here. In a photograph that you have here from the 18th century, it's a more elegant environment, more elegant figures that are defined as a family in this particular era. Other eras are ones closer to our time. The early part of the century, of the 20th century, shows the father seated here and holding on his lap probably another male child. And this is perhaps the mother. It's hard to say. And we have figures of the females on the left side of the picture. What does that, for example, say about family relationships? And when you look at your various plays, you have to decide what does it mean? What does family mean to the individuals involved? In this particular instance, for example, if you were looking at Raisin in the Sun, you would want to know whether there's a decided difference between the way family structure is formed in a Caucasian family as opposed to a black family. And that would probably hold true when you're looking at families from other parts of the society. Here you have another family setting, family portrait, and yet another one, and a more modern family portrait here. One thing to remember is that playwrights often redefine what a family is, so that in the Rez Sisters and in Aunt Dan and Lemon, there are almost two different approaches to what constitutes a family. I know that it's possible, for example, to when I directed the Heidi Chronicles some years ago, Heidi, there's no mention whatsoever um, of the parents of any of the figures that appear in that play, but there is the sense that Heidi's friends become her family. And in a sense, that helps to establish some notion of what this play is particularly about. It's redefining what family is in society. We might also see that happening in plays dealing with lesbians or plays dealing with homosexuals, in that there's a notion of family that is perhaps even stronger or more decided than one between a child and his parents. Another thing that Boll emphasizes, of course, that one should not try to read plays for generalities such as mood and atmosphere, because that can actually lead you down the wrong path, especially for designers, where the temptation is to read a play and then think what the mood of this play is, or what the atmosphere might be of this particular work. A couple of photographs of atmosphere and of mood. And as you can see, Steve seems to be and possess virtually the same mood all the time, except when he's got his eyes closed when he's asleep. And, of course, this is a kind of atmospheric or moody representation of the Taj Mahal in early morning sunlight. So be aware that it's better to know the details of the script and why the playwright has created the dramatic action in the way he or she has, rather than read the play looking for mood. Another thing to be aware of is what is the unique factor in a play. In other words, what is out of the ordinary that causes a turn of events, setting the play into motion? Many plays actually depend on circumstances that create unique factors. I think one could easily point out the unique factor in the beginning of Oedipus is the fact that the plague has become so difficult to bear that the people have gone to the king to ask for his assistance in attempting to address the issues that they have and to try to find a solution to their woes. Usually that unique factor is tied to the intrusion, which breaks the stasis. So in fact, if you ask yourself, why are the events of the play taking place on this particular day instead of yesterday or last week or last year, I think it'll help you to formulate a notion of what the unique factor is really meant to do for you. It's really meant to help you to understand why playwrights have adjusted their work accordingly. In Hedda Gabler, for example, the unique factor in this play is the fact that Hedda and Tesman have returned home from their honeymoon. So essentially this is a unique factor that's been introduced into their lives and to the lives of others around them. And all of the plays we deal with have these various matters to be concerned with. Another thing that he points out is changing arrows. You might try to find out what the original audience had thought about the play and the circumstances of the play, because that may help you to understand more fully what the play is about. And you have to also ask yourself the question, as a creative artist, must a production of this play, my production of this play, always reflect the time period in which the playwright says the work? Or should I, in fact, take the position that I can adjust or change the period in time in which the play takes place? And that, of course, holds true for a number of plays. Does a change in time period and place affect the play's content? This is one of those things that I essentially ask you in your midterm exam to address. That is, why have the designers and directors of the video versions of the plays chosen the particular time period and place that they have? I'll just show you a few examples from Richard III. This is a portrait of the actual Richard III. Well, in most of Shakespeare's times, he was made out to look something like this. This is the famous Richard III. And here we see a more modern Richard III, very different look, time period, obviously suggesting a modern Richard. Another version of Richard is with these crutches. Richard was thought to have a hunchback, and this is the Royal Shakespeare Company version of Richard III, in which he's got a very prominent hunchback and has these very sinister-looking canes that he uses to walk with. Also, yet another version of Richard III, a pudgier version in which he's addressing the woman that he has a lech for and tells her to stab him if his intention's not good. And yet another version of Richard III, and this one, you see the actor creates that hunchback feel with his movements of his right foot and hand. And in this one, we have a totally different version of Richard III, set in the Middle East, probably in Saudi Arabia, and this gives you some sense of how the liberties that may be taken with such a character. The next thing that Ball points out is the notion of climax. Climax is essentially a turning point in which changes, in which all of the factors, the conflicts, come to a boiling point. And it is at this point there's a turning point in the dramatic action. And as I pointed out to you when we were dealing with Oedipus Rex, you see that the beginning in what this version has said, the incisive moment starts the action of the play. The murder of Laos that has been predicted, and that Oedipus decides that he's going to take action in order to find the murderer Laos, leads steadily towards the climax. And then there's almost quick falling action after this occurs. And this is a scene from The Crucible, in which the girls imagine that they see the yellow bird, that's the witch that's besieging them. Of course, dramatically, this might be considered the climax in one sense of the play, but the real climax of the play is when John Proctor refuses to sign his name to the document saying that he's seen witches. And that comes in the next act, because you can't have a climax and then have a very long act following it. Essentially, the climax has to be closer toward the end of the play. Ball also talks about beginnings and endings, and he talks about the fact that one could determine what the beginning stasis of the play is and what the ending stasis of the play happens to be. And that plays could take place either before the beginning stasis of the play at hand, or they could happen after that point, in which case that leads to the next play. And so one might well imagine, of all the plays that we've been dealing with, such as Hedda, such as Oedipus, such as Res Sisters, what will be the next action of the characters after the play is over with? And indeed, what happened to the characters before the stasis of the play at hand? Ball insists that your duty is to read and reread the play as many times and as often as possible. And essentially, he he's insisting that without proper reading of the play, you can't really understand how the play works. And that often requires you to spend time not only on the internet, but at the library gathering material about a particular work. He also suggests that this is true no matter who you are, whether you're a man or a woman. In this case, a little boy and a little girl, it seems, are intensively reading whatever they happen to be reading here. And the wise old owl, he's pointing out, only dumb readers come in last. He's also suggesting to you that once you've done all the things that he suggested in his book, what comes next? Well, the most obvious thing of what comes next is that you apply your creative abilities to the play at hand in order to produce the work for the public. And but unless you have carefully followed the prescriptions that he's given you about how to read a play, you really shouldn't move to the next step. You should have a firm grasp of what you understand the play to be and how it works before you move to the final stage or the next stage. And so that's all that essentially Ball has to say about these matters, and that's in fact all that I'm going to say to you. Thanks for listening.